Good morning, and thank you all for adapting so well to that a little surprise that we had. Expect the unexpected. I'm Ramez Naam. I'm going to talk today about exponential innovation, which means how can your organization, how can your companies adapt to and take advantage of all of this technology. You're going to hear throughout the day, throughout the 2 days, a tremendous amount about technology. But I'm going to tell you, and Larry Keeley will emphasize this, technology is not a sustaining advantage, because you can buy technology. Most of what we'll talk about, you can acquire in some way. What matters is how you use that technology in your company, the business models you have, and how quickly you can innovate. And so, about me, I am by training a computer scientist, and I'm a computer scientist that has a clicker that does work. I spent 13 years at this company, Microsoft, and now I work mostly in energy, and I'm also, as Jeff said, a science fiction writer. And one thing about writing science fiction is you get to understand how poor people do, how badly we do at actually predicting the future. You think that science fiction predicts the future, but it doesn't. It actually puts forward an official future that almost never comes to pass. It reflects our linear thinking rather than exponential. Here's an example of that. This is sort of the official future in most science fiction. Giant starships the size of cities that are crewed by humans just like us, that haven't really changed, but that can go to faster than the speed of light, can visit other star systems. And this is a vision of the future that is all about building bigger, bolder, more expensive capital assets, if you will. That's the vision of space. But that's not the most exciting thing happening in space. Here's the most exciting thing happening in space, I think, or one of. This is a democratization. This is a CubeSat. A CubeSat is a 1.3 kilo payload that, because of Moore's law and the shrinkage of computing, the shrinkage of electricity demand of computing, and the increase of computing you cannot buy, can do what a 1,000 kilo satellite was required to do just 10 or 15 years ago. And these CubeSats cost about 20,000 euros to build and another 20 or 30,000 euros to launch. There are schools that have launched these into space. And this is what's actually happening in technologies. It's getting smaller, faster, and cheaper. Intelligence and computation is substituting for capital and scale and physical resources. Or think of another example. If you go back 10 or 12 years ago, what did the word drone mean to you? Might have meant this. This is an Mk9 Reaper drone. It's a Predator drone with missiles. This is a $20 million aircraft, and only governments could afford these. But now if you say drone, you might think of this. This is a high-end prosumer drone. It's a DJI Phantom 4 that costs $1,000. And it can't do everything that the Reaper can do, but for the cost of one of the Reapers, you can buy 20,000 of these, right? And that's a demonetization and democratization of tech. Or here's another official future. Our future in space would be crewed by elite humans that would steer these starships, and that's not the future. We will never actually allow humans to steer these ships in the future. This is the real future of control of space. This is a SpaceX launch. This is the first Falcon Heavy launch. Now, space is interesting. Space is the most demanding physical industry there is. A launch like this historically has cost around $100 million US, or about $10,000 per kilo that was launched. And it's cost that because even though the fuel costs only a few $100,000, and airlines fly at about 3 times the cost of fuel, so an airline for $300,000 would have about $1 million total of cost, not $100 million. What happens is, at the end of every launch, we throw away the vehicle. It's like if you flew from here to New York City, and at the end of that flight, we threw away the Airbus that you flew in. What would your ticket cost, right? But what's bringing this down isn't new physical tech, it's new software. How many of you have watched one of these SpaceX launches? Most of us have. Let's watch one just to ground ourselves on how amazing it is. Here's the first Falcon Heavy launch. keep the sound up, please. So these launches are exhilarating. There's a lot of new technology. SpaceX 3D prints the rocket engines in an alloy of titanium and nickel. They have more advanced sensors than any other company on their spacecraft. They've innovated in the fuel, but that's not the important part. The important part is this, and this is all done with software, is the ability to bring these vehicles safely back down to ground. That's what allows us to reuse them, and that software control is what will bring the cost of spaceflight down by at least a factor of 10 and maybe a factor of 100. It's more compelling if you watch even one of these earlier launches. This is the first successful Falcon 9 landing, and when you watch this thing coming down, it's aiming for this tiny target in the middle of the ocean, barely bigger than it is. It's deploying its legs at the last possible second, coming in on an angle. I mean, could Luke Skywalker even hit that landing, right? Probably Luke could, but not a lot of other humans could make that landing. So if software, if Moore's law is disrupting space, what industry can it not disrupt? It can disrupt any of them, is my answer. And all of that is really because of this observation that Jeffrey made about Moore's law. The shortcut for me is the cost of computing goes to 0, the cost of bandwidth goes to 0, the cost of data goes to 0, and that means the cost of coordination, disintermediation, cutting out the middleman, all of that goes to 0. So this guy, Mark Andreessen, he created the company Netscape. He wrote the first web browser in the world. He has this phrase that software is eating the world, and it's worth reading this essay, because he goes into sector after sector where computing is substituting for labor, capital, anything else. And so when Jeff talks about those 6 Ds, to me the ones that are the most exciting for the world and for business are the bottom 2. Demonetization, the price of tech going nearly to 0, and then the democratization that comes with that, and that profoundly affects business. Let's start with demonetization. Who remembers this film? Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, the hero you love to hate, or the villain you love to hate. He's a evil billionaire. He doesn't build things. He buys companies and tears them up for parts and sells them, right? Nobody likes this guy. To show how wealthy he is, they filmed this scene. This is Gordon Gekko with his smartphone that only billionaires could afford at the time. This is a Motorola Dynatac. It's about a $10,000 phone. It took 12 hours to charge. It held charge. It had a standby time of 30 minutes. No camera, no Snapchat, no email, no Spotify, nothing. And now this is the median cell phone user on planet Earth with a $35 Android phone that is light years better than Gordon Gekko's. And this has profound implications because we are headed for a world where all 9 billion people eventually on planet Earth have supercomputers in their pockets. Not just you, everyone that are connected by probably 6G networks that have cameras and real-time speech translation. And this is the greatest uplifting of humanity that has ever happened, because these people will have a device that can give them access to education. MIT's courseware is going to be free, that can allow them to communicate with people in any language, anywhere in the world. Give them access to markets. It's also the greatest growth of potential customers for you, because it used to be that all businesses were local, and now the world is so interconnected that any business almost can reach a global scale, and this is how you reach your customers. And it's also the best time on planet Earth to be an entrepreneur, because these people are super powered with capabilities to build businesses that build technology that didn't exist for the average human a decade ago. And so I'll show you that. How long does it take to make a $1 billion company? It used to take 20 years on average for a company on the S&P 500 to reach a $1 billion market cap. Now we have businesses like Oculus or Cruise that I'll talk about tomorrow that in 1 year have reached a $1 billion market cap. And the population of startups that are worth $1 billion is getting denser and denser and denser over time. And of course, some of these are overvalued, but many of them are not. And they're in every sector. They're in transportation, they're in healthcare, they're in real estate, they're in retail, they're in consumer goods, they're in personal finance. Any sector you are in, they are in. And they're mostly all digital. And they're mostly disrupting incumbents. Because this technology makes it the best of time for entrepreneurs and the average person, and it's the worst of times to be an incumbent large company, because these startups move faster than large incumbents. And I'll show you that. 90% of the Fortune 500 from the 1950s aren't on the list. A few are mergers, most are not. Most dropped off the list. And the life expectancy of companies on the S&P 500 is dropping. It used to be when you entered the S&P 500, you'd expect to stay there for 60 years. Now it's 15. Change is coming faster, and large companies do not adapt to that change nearly as rapidly as startups, and so they stand to lose. So how can you, most of you I think are from large companies, how can you optimize to be a winner in this and not a loser? How can you optimize to be the one that does the disrupting of others rather than being disrupted? Well, I'll give you 6 lessons from what we see in startups and the most innovative large tech companies. And to start that off, I'm going to give you a story, because what drives success is not how big your bank account is, not how many assets or employees your companies have. It's really how quickly you innovate, how agile you are, how adaptive to change, like the test that happened this morning inadvertently, and your ability to leverage these new business models, what Jeffrey called platform business models, that are all about the network effect, that grow in value exponentially as their user base grows linearly. And to give you that story of how innovation happens, let's go back 600 years to the war between, or the conflict between, 2 large organizations. This is Zheng He. Anyone know who Zheng He was? Not many do. Zheng He was probably the greatest sailor ever to live. He was in China under the 3rd Ming Emperor. He was commissioned to explore the world, and he had 8 epic voyages over his life, and he went down all the way almost to Australia, Southeast Asia, around India, Arabia, down the coast of Africa. And if he had had more voyages, he probably would have rounded the coast of Africa, found Europe, and maybe found the Americas, and history would be radically different. Okay? Now, we all know who this is. Christopher Columbus, right? And Columbus is orders of magnitude more famous, at least perhaps outside of China. And Columbus had really 4 voyages, and his first one changed the world by discovering the Americas. But it's funny because in every way, Zheng He was Columbus's superior. Zheng He was a better sailor. He actually knew how big the world was, which Columbus didn't. He was a better leader. He came from the richest society on Earth, a large unified empire with twice the population of Europe. He had access to better technology. He had better ships. This is a recreation of one of Zheng He's ships. Good-sized ship, so on. Let's compare it to Columbus's flagship. This is Zheng He's versus Columbus. Now, it's true that Columbus had 3 ships. Zheng He had 300 with 30,000 sailors, right? And yet, and he was also from probably the best run organization ever. The Chinese emperor didn't just have an emperor at the top. It had 20,000 bureaucrats, middle managers, that were selected by a meritocracy. They'd sat for tests that lasted days of how well they knew engineering and mathematics and politics and economics and so on, and only the very best were allowed to win. But Zheng He had a problem. The 3rd Ming emperor commissioned him, and then that emperor passed away, and China, you would say, got a new CEO. The 4th Ming emperor, the Hongsha emperor, and the Hongsha emperor said, there's a change of strategy, guys. He said, China is so rich, we're so prosperous, the outside world has nothing for us. So these experiments, these voyages into the unknown aren't worth it. I'm going to cancel them. And to enforce that, he burned the ships. He burned the greatest fleet ever. Maybe your boss has done that to you at some point in the past. I don't know, no comment, or you've seen it done. Meanwhile, Columbus, we think of Columbus as having a relatively straightforward story. He didn't. Columbus went hat in hand. He was an entrepreneur. He went around to every source of funding in Europe. Columbus comes from Genoa. He asked all the nobility of Genoa, a major seafaring power, for money. They all turned him down. Now, in typical human style, centuries later, when Columbus had been successful, they still built a statue to him. But they hadn't been willing to invest. He went to Portugal to King John II, and King John turned him down because Columbus told him how big he thought the world was. King John asked his advisors, and you see Columbus's model of the world is missing something in the middle. And his advisors said, this guy's a fool. They'd known since Aristotle how big the world was. They said, don't invest in him. He doesn't know anything. He came to Spain. He pitched Isabella. Isabella said no. He went to England. His brother introduced him to King Henry VII. King Henry said no. He went back to Portugal. He pitched King John a second time. King John said no. He pitched another dozen large sources of funding in Europe. He finally came back to Spain. It was after Isabella and Ferdinand had unified all of Spain. And you can see Isabella's reaction to him. This guy again. But maybe to get rid of him, Isabella said, okay, fine. We'll fund 3 ships. High risk, it's probably not going to work, but high reward if you find a new way to trade spices. And that meant that 50 years later, this was the Spanish Empire. Right? And Isabella was the richest woman on planet Earth. And that change happened despite the fact that China had 3 times the GDP. China had better technology, the compass, gunpowder, woodblock printing, better ships. And Europe was emerging from the Dark Ages, right? So how did this happen? Why did Europe out-innovate China? It happened because of this. Because in China, one person could make a bad decision. In Europe, innovation was organic. There were so many city-states in Europe, and any one of these princelings could incubate or nurture or be the venture capitalist to invest in a new innovation, that you just had more things being tried, and you had cross-pollination from nation to nation as people spread. You had competition between them, and that's what boosted the pace of innovation in Europe. And it didn't just lead to Columbus's voyage. That's why the printing press happened in Europe, which set off the Renaissance, which set off the scientific revolution, which set off the industrial revolution, and why the world changed here. Because of this decentralized bottoms-up innovation. And so I want you to ask yourself, is your company run more like China of the Renaissance or run more like Europe of the Renaissance, right? Because most companies are run a bit more like China, with innovation coming from the top down. And so that's lesson 1. Innovate from the bottoms up. That's what the most exponential organizations do. In fact, if we go back to that list of unicorn startups, the way that these companies come into existence isn't that there's one emperor of startups that decides what gets funding. It's that there's more than 1,000 venture capital firms that make divergent bets on what they think will succeed. And the way that venture capital works, it works through experimentation and through failure, through lots and lots of failure. Here's the venture capital return stack. On the left side is the number of deals done. Half of those deals go to 0. And in fact, this is omitting the very earliest stage deals. If you put in the very earliest stage deals, more than 90% of venture investments fail, right? But 6% of deals produce 60% of those returns. And among the very best firms, that's an even more lopsided ratio. The same number fail, but the top deals do even better. So let's say it again. Just the 10x deals, the ones that have that much return on investment, are only 6% of investments, but about 60% of returns. So do you in your organization have the tolerance to fail 50% or even 90% of the time in order to find those greater than 10x return projects or investments? Lesson 2, the most disruptive companies, the tech companies of the world, massively experiment inside their organization. Here's Amazon. On some days now, it's the most valuable organization on earth, and it's disrupted not just bookstores, but retail overall, and now cloud computing, and the home, and so much else. And the way that Amazon works is through massive experimentation. Every box on the Amazon homepage and on every screen is the result of thousands of experiments that have changed the algorithms, changed the data that was used, changed even the position of them on the screen to see what users click on most often in what order. And the way that Amazon works is what they call the default yes. If a 22-year-old engineer straight out of college decides that she has an idea to improve the site, she usually doesn't even ask her boss. She just codes it and ships it to the site. And even in just one little feature, this is the related books feature that gave birth to all of the product recommendation features, this feature has generated billions in profits for Amazon. And this one feature is the result of tens of thousands of experiments that have tweaked these algorithms, right? Even moving this feature around on the page has produced probably hundreds of millions of dollars in new value for Amazon. And so Amazon makes it easy for their employers to experiment. Now, this is digital. Say digital, it's easy, right? How many of you are in digital in some way? How many of you are in physical products of some sort? Usually that's a majority. Let's talk about experimentation in physical, because it happens. This is the America's Cup race. These are super advanced sailboats, and this is a race and a sport that was radically changed by a systematic process of experimentation. This is Black Magic, Team New Zealand, and this boat is considered the most dominant boat in the history of sailing. It doesn't look like much, but it was. And that's interesting because the America's Cup, until Black Magic, in 150 years of this race, an American team had won the race every time except twice in 150 years. So it was really dominated by the Americans. And the Team New Zealand came into this race knowing that they had a less experienced captain, less experienced shipbuilders, a less experienced crew, and 1/3 of the budget of the American team. They were a massive underdog. So what they did was they decided to focus on one thing. They would focus on the part of the boat at the bottom of the screen, the keel, the part that sticks in to the bottom. They said that's the only thing we're really going to focus on. And to try to improve that, they used brand new computing platforms, a Spark station, much less powerful than your phone, to do computational fluid dynamics and simulate how the water flowed over the keel. But in that, they were already behind. The Americans were using the cray that Jeffrey showed you. So they did one more thing. They said, we are going to systematically experiment. Because the American team thought, we'll design the boat. We might change it once or twice in the course of a year. But mostly, we're going to focus on drilling the crew, practicing strategy. Team New Zealand said, we're going to systematically, rapidly experiment on the boat. And they designed a process where every day in the morning, the sailors would sail the boat, and they'd time it. Then they'd come back. They'd have the timing data, and they'd have the feedback from the sailors. And a set of keel designers would take that and say, we're going to design a change to the keel. And they do that in the afternoon. And then in the evening, a set of fabricators would take over, and overnight, they would fabricate a brand new keel and mount it on the boat. And so every single day, sail the boat, design a new keel, build a new keel, and mount it. They got 50 times more experiments than Team America. But they had another problem, even though they were doing this every day, because if you're sailing a boat, if any of you have sailed, you understand that some days the sea is calm, and some days the sea is rough. So how do you know if you have a better or worse time? Was it the new keel, or was it the weather? And so they made an incredibly bold move. All the way to the underdog, they spent 1/3 of their budget to build a second boat. 1/3 of their entire product design budget to do this, just so they could have an apples-to-apples comparison. So they'd mount the new keel on one boat, and the other boat that was identical in every other way would have the old keel. So they could compare them and have accuracy in their experiment. Right? 1/3 of their budget just to get that experimentation accuracy, right? And that is what led them to victory. And not just victory, but the most dominant victory ever. Team New Zealand won the America's Cup 5 races to 0. It's a best-of-9 series. They won the first 5 races, and that was it. And no other team has ever done that before or since. And they did that entirely because they took this cycle of test, design, build, and they made it as fast and as accurate and as often as possible. And you see that in other businesses. You see that in fast fashion, where you have companies that bring out new fashion products every 6 weeks to learn from the old ones and move things in the market. You see it in 3D printing, where companies use 3D printing to more rapidly experiment with the designs of their products, from small plastic parts to how SpaceX builds their rocket engines. So that's number 2, experiment. But experimentation doesn't work unless you also do number 3, which is embracing failure, right? Because experimentation is a process mostly of failing. What percentage of these experiments for Amazon resulted in an improvement to the site? Less than 1%. So this is an issue of tolerance of this in your company, budgeting for it, but it's also a cultural issue. Are you going to reward people who experiment if they've run 10 experiments in a row and haven't succeeded? Because if you don't reward them, if you punish them, if they get passed over for promotion, if they don't get a raise, if they think this is a career-limiting move, guess what? They're not going to experiment. And if they don't experiment, you won't get new ideas. And if you don't get new ideas, you'll be overtaken by companies that do have new ideas. We all understand the risk of taking action. We underestimate the risk of lack of action, right? And Bezos gets this. Bezos says he's made billions of dollars of failure at Amazon, and that's the secret to Amazon's success, and he's happy to make billions more. Seth Godin, who's an innovation expert, talks about what you have to do to make failure and experimentation work, because it's not easy. Amazon couldn't just say anyone can ship a new feature to the site, because that risked taking down the entire Amazon website. It risked hurting their brand. They had to invest heavily over the course of years and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, of building platforms that made it safe to experiment. Because you want to fail fast and cheap. So you build a platform so that anyone in your organization that wants to experiment can do it quickly and with a low budget. And that takes a big fixed expense up ahead of time. And you want to fail often. You want to build systems so that many people can run experiments in parallel. And you want to also fail in a way that doesn't kill you, that doesn't tank your brand, doesn't tank your reputation, doesn't tank your main product. And all of that takes advanced planning to make that possible. All right, number 4, if you want to experiment, you want to allow failure, you want to try new things, you have to bias for action and autonomy and not for permission seeking. How many of us have sat in rooms like this one? This is a consensus process, and for some things, a consensus process is extremely important for the ethics of your company, for the goals of your company, for the culture of your company. But this is where innovation goes to die. Because if you have someone who wants to innovate and they have to get permission of every person in this room, marketing, ops, legal, sales, division A, division B, division C, guess what? It never happens. It's asymmetric. Any person in this room can veto an idea and they all have to agree for an idea to go forward. Get over it. It's not going to happen. You will have no innovative ideas, right? The buzzword in Silicon Valley is permissionless innovation. It means literally people can innovate without having to ask. And that means giving autonomy to your people. And that also has the benefit that it gets the best out of your people. It gets their best thinking. If people are just doing what they're told, they're just robots, right? It's when they're using their brain to do things that you didn't think of, the leadership didn't think of, that's when you're using their mind. And in fact, we see this. Jobs says, we don't hire smart people at Apple so we can tell them what to do. We hire them so they can tell us what to do, or so they can just do it, right? And that's funny because Jobs is one of the more controlling tech CEOs, or was, but even he had that idea. Maslow wrote Maslow's Hierarchy ages ago, right? And what he put was, after physical needs and basic emotional needs, the highest thing people could get was this sense of self-actualization. And when employees in your company have that ability to self-actualize by trying things on their own, they work harder, they bring their A game, they bring their best ideas, and they love their job. They stay and they attract the best of other employees. Now, it's true that Maslow was a little bit wrong. He was a little bit out of date on this, because he didn't see the importance of things like Wi-Fi at the base of this pyramid, or of a battery life below that, something all of you might experience on your phones by the end of this day. But basically, he was onto something, I think. But some of the most innovative companies in the world work this way. Spotify, not so big in parts of Europe, but in America, it dominates music, along with Apple Music. And Spotify's watchword is they make small teams, they give them autonomy, mastery, and purpose. The team knows what they're trying to achieve. They have mastery because you've hired the best people, and they have autonomy. You get out of their way, and they pick how they're going to achieve that goal. And in Spotify, the management motto is that trust beats control. Hire good people, give them autonomy, have clear agreement on what the purpose is of their team, and then trust them, and don't try overly to control them. All right, number 5. The most disruptive companies don't have a commodities business model. They don't have a product business model. They have a business model that is all about data, platforms, network effects, virtuous cycles, or what Amazon calls the flywheel. In the age of AI, data is the lifeblood. With the more data you have, the better your AI will be. So one business model is use your data, capture the data you already have being put out there, use it to make a better version of the AI, use that to get more customers that give you more data, and that's a hard thing for a competitor to catch up with. But this platform business model is even bigger than that. I cut my teeth at Microsoft, and we had this fundamental business model with Microsoft Windows, that every business that installed Windows made it a more attractive operating system for third-party developers to write their software for. If it was Adobe or any other third party, they would write for whatever operating system had the most share, right? And then every third party writing software for your operating system made your operating system more valuable for businesses and consumers to install. It was a double-sided marketplace. Your partners made the product more valuable for your customers made it more valuable for your partners. Apple copied this with the App Store, and that's part of why Apple has been so successful. No App Store, no Apple monopoly. Clones would have taken them, but for the fact that all the apps are available on this. Facebook uses the same thing. Every picture you upload, you're both a producer, you're both a partner, and a consumer. Every picture you upload makes Facebook more valuable for everyone else who's looking at pictures on Facebook. So when Andreessen says software is eating the world, he actually didn't go far enough, because when you look at business model, it's actually networks that are eating the world, not just software. Let me show you a few more examples of that. Here's Uber. Uber is now the most valuable transportation company on Earth. It's got a $69 billion, $70 billion valuation, and Uber owns no cars. So what gives them their value? Is it Uber's technology? No. Larry's going to talk about how you can buy all the pieces of Uber's technology. Probably for a few $1,000,000, you could build all of the Uber technology stack. So it's not the technology. That's not 70 billion. What gives Uber their value is the network effect, that every person using the Uber app to look for a ride makes it more attractive for drivers to drive for Uber. And every person driving for Uber shortens your wait time when you call out the app. And that attracts more users, and on and on and on. Or Airbnb, second most valuable hospitality company with a more than $30 billion market cap. Airbnb owns no real estate, right? What gives them the value? It's not the tech, it's the network effect, the double-sided marketplace. Every host listing their property on Airbnb increases Airbnb's inventory. That makes it a better experience for every user searching on Airbnb. And then every user searching on Airbnb makes it a more attractive place to list your property. And that network effect is almost impossible to unlodge once it's there. So don't go trying to build the next Uber or Airbnb, but find a way in your business that you can tap into this network effect. And even for physical hardware, that's possible. I'm going to talk tomorrow about self-driving cars, and the wild horse, the underdog in this race is Tesla, but Tesla has a unique advantage, which is that its vehicles have driven 2 billion miles in autopilot or shadow mode. So they have the most data. And that's what they think gives them a critical edge. So even physical products, if you're capturing the data, can have that network effect. They call it fleet learning. All right, number 6. The most disruptive companies have the courage to disrupt themselves, and very few companies actually do. You all know the story of Kodak, right? Why did Kodak go bankrupt after inventing the digital camera? Was it because they didn't understand the exponential pace of progress? No, eventually they got that. Here's why Kodak went bankrupt. This was Kodak's largest profit stream. When a guy named Steve Sasson introduced the digital camera in Kodak, he presented it to the board as the filmless camera. What do you think the response of the vice president responsible for film sales was? Did that person really support the development of this in the company? Kodak was too terrified to disrupt their cash cow, to disrupt their biggest revenue stream, to embrace this new technology. Did that stop digital cameras from coming into existence? No, because the tech was out there in the world. Or how about the music industry? The music industry, we all love music in various ways. These were the leaders in music a decade or so ago, and they sold us music on these things. I still have some in my basement, I think. I'm not sure what to do with them. And it's been a brutal period for the music industry, because music industry revenues have dropped, and especially that dark blue, that's physical media revenue, it has plunged by 80%. But there's good news. Music industry revenue bottomed out in 2014. It's been growing since then, and the new growth in digital is actually higher profit margin. So music industry profits in another 10 years will be their highest of all time as this streaming and so on takes over. So naturally, these companies made the smart move to pivot into digital music, right? No, what did they do? They sued. They sued their customers who just wanted to listen to their music. They went to Brussels, they went to DC, they said there ought to be a law that said these are pirates, despite the fact that they knew two things. They knew people loved listening to music this way, and they knew that technology was going to keep getting better. These devices would keep getting faster, faster bandwidth, more storage on the device. It was obvious that it was inevitable. But rather than trying to embrace the disruption and disrupting themselves, they fought it and they let somebody else disrupt it. So now these are the leaders in music around the world. So have the courage to disrupt yourself. Those are the 6 things. But I'm going to give you a bonus 7th thing, which drives the passion and engagement you will get from your customers, your partners, and employees, which is the most disruptive companies act with purpose. And I've spoken at enough Singularity events to know that you're not just here to improve your business. Most of you are here because you're patriots, you care about your nation, you care about your world, you care about your children, and you want a better world. This is one of my gurus, Tim O'Reilly, who's a Silicon Valley guru, and he has this phrase: the best companies create more value than they capture. It's okay to capture value, but this is his advice to startups. Create more value than you capture. Make the world a better place in some way. And we see organizations with the chutzpah to do that. We have this worry you'll hear about, perhaps, will AI destroy our jobs? Well, here's one organization that said, let's try something. This is MIT. And MIT made a commitment a few years ago to take 100% of their curriculum and put it online for free. This is maybe their crown asset, right? What do you think that meeting was like? When somebody said, hey, boss, I want to take our asset and just make it free for everybody, right? That took courage, took cojones, as they say, right? Right? And yet, it also created a sense of meaning. Now, everyone at MIT and the people in their foundation, and the people that give to their endowment, their students, think of this as, wow, we're having a meaningful impact on the world. It's not just about the bottom line. I feel good because we're doing something. And that drives that engagement and that trust from partners, donors, investors, and especially employees. We used to think that the most powerful emotion that a human could feel was gratitude. Go back and think about any given day that you're stressed. Write down 3 things that you're grateful for within the day, because that's actually scientifically demonstrated to improve your physical, mental, and emotional well-being. But now we know that there's actually an emotion that is more powerful than gratitude. My friend Adam Grant, here's him speaking at TED, he wrote this book, Give and Take, and he documents research that he and his team did that found that there's something more powerful than asking people what they're grateful for, which is if you ask people at the end of the day to write down, what did you contribute? How did you help someone else? Contribution lifted all of those measures of health and mental well-being even more than gratitude. And what's more, without meaning to, it got these people to double down. These people started contributing more when they just wrote down a list of what they have done. And so that is the most powerful emotion we know of. And Maslow, later in life, came back. He didn't add Wi-Fi, but he did add something beyond self-actualization. And he called it self-transcendence. And the best companies give themselves, their employees, and everyone around them, their customers, this feeling that they are acting with purpose beyond themselves. So that's the 7 things disruptors do. And I'll leave you with the words of Charles Darwin, who coined the phrase, the survival of the fittest. But Darwin didn't say that it's just the fittest. He said it's not the strongest of the species or even the most intelligent that survives, but the ones most responsive to change. The world is changing, and I hope you will have the courage to change with it. Thank you all very much. I'll see you tomorrow.